And now that we have talked a little bit about the powers that the president has, a limited scope, we also want to begin talking about the rights that we have in the homes, schools, hospitals, public places, if you're on the road, and driving. Next slide.
Are dealing with a little bit of
Technical problems here.
technical to allow the PowerPoint.
Give us 1 second, please.
In the meantime, someone is asking about the PowerPoint. We will be posting. John, are we allowed to share in our web page,
Yeah,
Bienvenidos webpage, the PowerPoint?
yes, and I can send you a version on a
Yes, we will. That means that we can we will be posting in our website to for people to be able to download and share if they want to do more presentation space in this, they can do that. Are we good now?
Yeah.
We good now. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you. We're here to adapt, so no worries. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about the rights at the homes, the hospitals, schools, works on the streets. Next slide. So before we begin going into the different rights in these different scenarios, it's important to understand, general concepts. This is going to be key when it comes to um, practicing your rights and enforcing your rights. So knowing the difference between public versus private spaces. And also understanding that there's legal protections that come from the US Constitution, whether it's the Fourth or the Fifth Amendment. It's something also to mention, and something that we have seen a lot is the constant weaponization, demonization of immigrants, and how we've seen like it seems like no one has rights. The Constitution is very clear. People have rights. People, it's people. It doesn't mean regardless of your immigration status. It says you have rights under the Constitution. People do. So that's where those protections come for everyone, whether you have immigration status or not. And with the Fourth Amendment, it protects you from unreasonable search and seizures by the government. This means that the police or other authorities can't search you, your home, your car, or take stuff without a good reason. An example of that is like they need to have a warrant or probable cause. And with the Fifth Amendment, that protects you from self-incrimination, double jeopardy, and guarantees due process. So what does that mean? That means you don't have to answer any questions that can get you in trouble. So that's where the phrase "you have the right to remain silent" comes from. So those are like key areas that protects everyone. And also to understand that ICE, Immigration Customs and Enforcement, is the immigration police. So it's very important for community members to not give information that will harm or prejudice themselves. And that includes showing them a passport from another country or your consular ID or DUIs, which is a unique identification form from certain countries. Because at the end of the day, it has the burden of proof to show that you are not supposed to be here is ICE. And here in Virginia, we have several different ways where community members can obtain IDs that they don't have to carry IDs from their countries. We have the driver's privilege cards, we have the identification privilege card, And some localities, like Fairfax counties, provide municipal IDs for nonprofits. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we have protections under the Fourth and Fifth Amendment. And these protections apply in different ways, depending on the circumstances, especially when encountering federal agents, such as ICE agents, police, and others. And this is where it's important to understand like the rights at the home and at the streets and what the outcomes can look like, especially when immigration encounters, because there's more protected rights in the home versus in a public street. And we'll go over that here shortly. Next slide. All right, now we'll go over the rights at the home. And this is where a lot of the protections we have are the strongest. And this is where it's important to ensure we know the differences of a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant. Next slide. And I do want to note that I do see Ms. Ramirez's question. I will be answering questions for the end. So thank you, Ms. Ramirez, for that question. So the house is a private space, and this is where the greatest protection comes from the Fourth Amendment. So the person who lives in the house has the right to deny any person to enter. And this also applies to law enforcement as well as ICE officers. So it's ICE is knocking on the door. The resident doesn't have to offer permission for them to enter. They can only enter the house if they have a judicial warrant. And you may be asking, well, what does a judicial warrant look like? How do I know if it's valid? And so a judicial warrant, and we'll go over and we have examples of how they look like, is a warrant that has been signed by a judge. So that means that ICE has gone in front of a federal magistrate and say they would like to arrive to John Cano's house. And they give their reasoning why, and the judge will sign off or not sign off. In most of the cases, and any of the cases we have seen, we've never seen ICE carry a judicial warrant. What we have seen is an administrative warrant, and we'll go over that in a little bit. So let's say that ICE does have a judicial warrant. Does that still give them the right to enter? Yes and no. Yes, because you also have to make sure that even though that judicial warrant has been signed by a judge, you need to make sure that the information on that judicial warrant is correct. So for example, making sure the name is spelled correctly and the address is spelled out correctly. So let's say if they put John Cano as Jon instead of John, or they put two N's on my last name instead of one, it's not a correct judicial warrant. If the address is wrong and they're trying to serve and say that I live at 123 Leeway Highway, apartment 1, but I live in apartment 2, that judicial warrant also has no validity because that judicial warrant has my name spelled wrong and it has a different address. So with that, that's where we need to be sure and be ready to read and determine if our name is spelled correctly and the address is spelled correctly. And if when asking ICE agents to show that document, ask them to either show it via the window, if you have a storm door, or they can slip it under, or if you have a window near your door, have them show it to you. Now, we know that some folks and some doors don't have a way to slip those papers down the door, but most doors have the little peepholes to see who's knocking at the door. So that's another good option is to have them put that document in there and to look out for that information, whether it's judicial or an administrative warrant. As always, people should not give consent to ICE, as most of the times ICE does not have a judicial warrant. And it's also key to recognize that ICE agents may sometimes lie or trick to convince someone to let them in. So they can say, we're investigating on something that happened in the neighborhood. We would like to ask you some questions. Can we come in? they will always try to find some type of way to come in, but it's always important. And since this is your home, you have the right to deny someone access. Next slide. So let's say ICE comes to the door of your home. You have the right to keep the door closed and always, as I mentioned earlier, not giving them permission to enter and remain silent. As I mentioned about the judicial warrant, if ICE has a judicial warrant and say they're looking for someone else that's not John, the person can ask them to show that order through the window or the door, as I mentioned before. And as importantly, and I'll be repeating this over and over about the judicial warrant, is that a judicial warrant is signed by a judge. It's not signed by an employee of ICE or any agent under ICE. And why this is important is because administrative warrants are not signed by a judge, but it is signed by someone else within the agency. And in no way, shape, or form should people show ICE documents that identify themselves from their country of origin. Next slide. So here are the examples of an ICE warrant and a judicial warrant. It may be a little difficult for y'all to see, but to the left where you see the ICE warrant or the administrative warrant, if you see on the top side, it says the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Why isn't this administrative warrant valid at the House? This administrative warrant, one, they haven't gone in front of a federal magistrate to get access. Two, this is just a directive within the agency telling that ICE official to go arrest someone. It hasn't gone through the proper channels, like going through the court system, speaking to a judge. So when encountering ICE agent or any agent that is enforcing immigration law, an administrative warrant will always have the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And if you see here, there's no space in this administrative warrant that has a place where a judge can sign. So that's going to be the key indicators for folks to determine whether it's an administrative warrant or a judicial warrant. An administrative warrant does not have an area that says signed by magistrate judge. Now, a judicial warrant is a little different because it does carry weight at the home. But as I mentioned earlier, you would want to look for the following. You would like to look for the signature of a judge. As you can see down here at the bottom right, it says signed by judge. And on the top side of the judicial warrant, there's an address. You also want to make sure that the address is spelled correctly, and if it's serving for a person, to make sure that person's name is spelled correctly as well. Next slide. Now we talked a little bit about the rights of the homes. Before we go into the other spaces, such as churches, schools, and hospitals, I do want to talk about the sensitive location memo. This was a former memo that was established in 2011 that directed and provided guidance to ICE where they should not be entering areas. And these areas were known as sensitive location areas, such as churches, schools, hospitals. As of January 20th of this year, that memo is no longer valid. So ICE can enter these areas, churches, schools, hospitals. But just because they can enter those areas, that doesn't mean that we still don't have rights. ICE still has limits as authority, especially in public space, private spaces. So again, this is where it's important for us to determine public spaces versus private spaces. So with public spaces, we're talking about lobbies, whether you're going to your local coffee shop, ICE can enter there. Any public space where you and I can enter, an ICE agent can enter as well. Areas where they cannot enter are those private areas, private spaces. In those private spaces, they need a judicial warrant. ICE must have an administrative warrant to arrest someone in public spaces. Now, this is different from the home because it's a public space where anyone has access to. ICE officers can issue an administrative warrant based on probable cause that someone does not have immigration status at the time. And this is where these civil enforcement actions can take place. And this is why we're asking folks not to carry documents that could self-incriminate themselves or saying that they're not from this country. And we ask for, especially for folks that live in Virginia, or even folks listening that live in DC and Maryland, the whole DMV provides IDs to undocumented folks. And I saw in the chat that there's someone asking about how to obtain driver's privilege card. Happy to share that information as well. Next slide. As I mentioned, there's always rights in private spaces. So if ICE were to show up, whether it's a hospital, at the workplace, we have rights in private spaces. In those private spaces, ICE must have a judicial warrant. And that's, as I mentioned, signed by a federal magistrate to arrest someone in that particular space. In these private spaces can be the employee area at a restaurant, whether that's the kitchen, whether it's the break room, or an area like, for example, at the hospital where one is waiting to be seen by the nurse, or you're having that one-on-one conversation with the administrative person about insurance and questions about where you live. Any area where you have privacy and confidentiality, those are considered private spaces. So those areas is where ICE would need a judicial warrant. And again, an administrative warrant only directs ICE agents what to do, nothing else. It doesn't obligate the local police, social service providers, or anyone else to take action. An administrative warrant only directs ICE agents. And now that we talked about the rescinding of the sensitive location memo, we also want to just share, like, what can folks do, whether at schools, hospitals, churches. We want to provide some guidance and things for individuals to consider to protect their clients, to protect their staff, and anyone that's coming to obtain their services. Next slide. Oh, so the recommendations we're giving folks is to ensure to have a plan. So identify what spaces are public or private in each building. Possibly creating additional private spaces by adding signs that says for personnel only or members only, and ensure that those spaces are locked. Decide what actions to take when ICE arrives and determine those roles. So who would be the spokesperson to speak with ICE, what questions to ask, and those can be one of the followings. Ask ICE why they are there. Look over any document that they are presenting, ensuring whether it's a judicial warrant or the administrative warrant. Review to verify that information is correct, date, timing, signature. If there's no administrative warrant, ICE cannot arrest anyone without additional evidence. And it's important in all scenarios, as it's mentioned in the Fourth Constitution, we have the right to remain silent. So in any of these scenarios where ICE may possibly arrive, it's important to always practice your right to remain silent and have key folks and these spaces that will be liaisons and taking the lead to speak with the ICE agent. And ICE agents will try to be persistent, but again, we have rights, and just drawing the line saying, I have the right to remain silent if you're a community member where ICE is present, or if you're the person designated to speak with ICE, saying that they have no authority, we're not giving you access to our information. They will be persistent for a bit, but eventually they will leave. And that's where it's very important to have that plan and to develop scripts as well. How will we react? Who's going to be that liaison? Who's going to be documented the case? Who's going to be providing support to the community at this time, ensuring that everyone is practicing the right to remain silent. Next slide. And now we'll be talking about the rights in the hospitals. And in all these next scenarios, you'll be seeing a common theme where the rights in the hospitals and other areas carry over. So this information may be repetitive, but it's also good practice for us to like really hone in and absorb the rights we have. So a lot of this will be repetitive, but it's important for us to understand that these rights can carry in different areas. Next slide. So rights in the hospital. So many hospitals are public spaces, whether that is the waiting room and the emergency room. But to access a private area, so an area that's not considered public, such as a medical center, or the waiting area, waiting to be seen or screened by a nurse or a doctor, ICE agents must have a judicial order or the consent of a person authorized by the hospital, or, as I mentioned earlier, probable cause. As I mentioned, healthcare providers do not have any affirmative legal duty to investigate, nor to inform federal immigration authorities on the immigration status of a patient. Here in the Commonwealth, there is no law or statute that requires folks to ask these type of questions, with the caveat depending on the services that folks are obtaining, whether it's services the federal level that has certain requirements where they ask about immigration status. But healthcare providers do not have any affirmative legal duty to investigate nor to inform federal immigration authorities of immigration status of a patient. And also, we have rights under HIPAA, so we also want to talk about that as well. Next slide. And so before we talk a little bit about HIPAA, go back one more slide. As always, as best practice, if ICE were to arrive at the hospital, you have the right to remain silent. As always, please do not show any documents that that shows from your country of origin. It's always important, again, to carry a document from the US for folks in Virginia, whether that's a DPC, IPC. DPC is driver's privilege card. IPC is the identification privilege card. As always, people have the right to consult an attorney before making any decisions about the immigration case. And this is where it's a little different versus the criminal side, as being and crossing the border is a civil violation, not a criminal violation. So with a criminal violation, and we hear this a lot in police shows or in courts, you have the right to remain silent. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. When it comes to immigration, that's not the case. Folks have to obtain their own representation, whether that's a private attorney or a low-cost attorney. So that's a little different when it comes to the other systems. But with immigration cases, it's up to the individual to obtain their own representation. As I mentioned, under HIPAA, we have protections where the only information that can be disclosed if only the patient gives that authority. Many of us have gone through the healthcare system, whether we have visited one emergency center or we have changed doctors before they obtain our full medical records, right? We always have to sign off on documents allowing them to obtain records from our previous doctor. So we have several protections under HIPAA, and there's certain things that they cannot share with immigration. Next slide. So now that we talked a little bit about the rights at the hospital, we also want to talk a little bit about the rights at the schools. Next slide. So rights at the schools. So federal law prohibits discrimination in public education, and that's including discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Discrimination based on immigration status and access to basic public education also violates the Constitution, primary and secondary school. As schools cannot be asked for information about immigration status. That also includes social security numbers. There's also rights that protects our children and students, and that's um, known as the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA for short, where it prevents schools from disclosing student education records, which includes information about their immigration status, except in exceptional circumstances. And those circumstances can be where a school can only release information to ICE officials with the consent of a parent, or if the student is above 18 years, or if it's necessary to comply with a court order or a subpoena signed by a judge. So these are the rights under FERPA, but also there's several jurisdictions that have trust policies that further protects their students and have come out with statements. So I know Fairfax County has a trust policy, not only from the county side, but for the school systems. We've seen several jurisdictions across the Commonwealth from the school system saying that they will be protecting their students, such as Richmond, Charlottesville, Chesterfield, and also will like to say Arlington does have the form of a trust policy as well. Next slide. So ICE in the schools. It's always important to know about the areas where ICE can and cannot enter. As I mentioned before, the sensitive location policies has been rescinded, so they could go into schools. But it's important to know the game plan of your local school. So reaching out to your local school board member, the school board chair, or your local principal, parent liaison to see what is their plan that they have in place. How will you protect our children? Who is in charge of speaking to ICE if they enter the school? And what kind of protection does the county have to protect confidential information? And this is all questions that you can ask directly to your school or your school board member. As I mentioned, several jurisdictions in the Commonwealth have come out with statements or policies that already are protecting our students. But you still have the right as a parent to always ensure and ask these questions to make sure like they're up to date and have proactive plans. God forbid, ICE were to show up at the school. Next slide. Now that we talked a little bit about hospital schools, we want to talk about the rights at work. Next slide. Again, the common theme, knowing the difference between a public and a private space. So in public spaces, as we have mentioned, ICE does not need a judicial warrant or an administrative warrant to enter. This is for a public space. Just many workplaces have just a waiting room or area where you and I can access. Again, ICE can access that area. It differs in private spaces. ICE cannot enter private spaces without a judicial warrant or permission of the employer. And the latter piece is crucial, and it's always important not only to have a game plan as an employee, but also to see if the employer has a game plan to protect its staff. Next slide. So if ICE were to show up at work, it's important that workers should not speak to ICE agents. And then again, the common theme that the workers should not be carrying any documents from another country. If ICE were to show up, workers should walk and they should not run and go calmly to a private area and close the door. So a lot of work areas have an area designated for their employees that says an employee only or personnel only. So it's crucial that folks slowly walk to those areas and close the doors. Um, if that's the case where at the work site there isn't an employees or a private area, it's good to have those discussions and plans with the supervisor, the owner of the business, the manager, developing that game plan. And also within that game plan, establishing that private versus public space that we mentioned earlier, but also determine who is going to be that point of contact that was going to be speaking with ICE, whilst all the other coworkers are going to that private area. And again, not answering any questions, not carrying any passports or documents from another country, um, and most importantly, not to run away. Next slide. And now we'll be talking about the rights in the streets. And again, the common theme is the public versus private space, but again, it's always important to know the more we listen to it, the more we'll be able to absorb and be able to practice this and share this information with others. Next slide. As I mentioned, outside of the home and the streets or public areas, the rights function a little differently. As we can recall, the most protections that we have is at the home. And in public spaces is a little different where ICE has and can arrest folks with an administrative warrant. So in public places, whether you're walking in the street or whether you're at your local coffee shop, just like anyone else, that we can start up a conversation. ICE officials can also start a conversation with any person in public. But it's also important to note if the person is not under arrest, that person can leave when they want to leave. It's always important to ask, am I being detained? Am I free to go? ICE officials can only arrest people in public spaces, as I mentioned earlier, with an administrative order. And that's something key. That administrative warrant does carry weight in public spaces. But if they're not being detained, if they don't have an administrative warrant, it's important to ask, am I being detained? Am I free to go? Next slide. We're going to talk about a little bit more as something that I already mentioned. ICE can start any conversations with individuals in a public space, but it's always important. And this not only applies to ICE, this also applies to any law enforcement officer. If you're being questioned, or always say, am I free to leave? May I leave? As always, people should not run away from ICE or any law enforcement. People should not lie to ICE. People have the right to remain silent. And as always, and with the common theme, always carry a document from Virginia, if you live in Virginia, from Maryland, and DC, and DC. And ICE will always try to ask several type of questions of law enforcement officers. It's always important to say, am I free to leave or may I leave? In no way, shape, or form should folks be asking any or answering any other questions, but just say, am I free to leave? Or also say, I'm practicing the right to remain silent. Next slide. So now let's talk about the scenario in the car. ICE agents occasionally may be involved in traffic stops when local police has notified ICE. I do want to say and note that in Virginia, there is no jurisdiction or locality that has any official agreement with ICE, whether it's a 287G agreement or whether it's an intergovernmental service agreement, also known by its acronym IGSA. Despite not having these type of official agreements with ICE, that does not mean that some police officers may take the law in their own hands and call ICE. We've seen some of these scenarios in the past. We saw it in Arlington, where a police officer called ICE because he believed that the person was undocumented. So sometimes local police may contact ICE. So I do want to note that despite not having any official agreements with ICE, that sometimes this does happen. So let's say the police officer did call ICE and ICE shows up. So if the person is pulled over, it's always custom that the police officer asks for the driver's license, registration, proof of insurance. Whether folks are citizens or non-citizens should always provide these documents. During this encounter, non-citizens or citizens alike may, and this is probably showing my age, roll down their window. We no longer roll down, right? We just click the button far enough where you can hand the officer those documents and have that conversation back and forth. I do want to note that use your best judgment, despite that we only have to roll the window halfway down, where we can have a conversation where the officer can hear me and I can hear him. If the officer is being a little bit too aggressive, use your judgment and just lower down the window completely. Folks that are in the car should remain calm and say that they're going to remain silent. And this applies to drivers and passengers alike. If police or ICE asks to look inside the car, we can refuse to give consent. Though if the police believes that the car contains evidence of a crime, police can search the car without consent. And so this is always something that we tell folks at presentations. Please make sure that there's no open containers, whether that's a bottle of wine, cans of beers. If you went tailgating or you're the designated driver with your friends, make sure that nothing that could give probable cause to the police to search your car. So that's always something that we're saying. And to avoid being pulled over, make sure that your car lights are functioning, your running daylights, your night lights, your turning signals, your brake lights, to make sure that there's no possibility where you're drawing the attention of the police officer that may detain you. So also as a driver, doing the due diligence to make sure that your car and everything on the outside is functioning perfectly. And that also includes ensuring that your inspection is up to date and then your tags for the car are up to date as well. So folks can always ask if they are free to go. And in these incidents or any of these scenarios, you have the right to record as well. To record any scenario and just make sure you're not disturbing what they say the investigation is, because recording is also going to be crucial in case this is going to be taken up with an attorney. Next slide. So now we want to talk about a little bit about ICE raids and what happens when one is in detention and the rights that folks have while in detention. Next slide. So in case of an ICE raid, it's important whether you're witnessing from afar, close. If you can do so safely, take photos of the place, take insignias of the officer, whether it's their badge or if it says police or ICE or ERO, ATF. Get anything that can identify that agency, the police, the law enforcement officer's name, and any details of the conversation that is happening. You guys can call our office and share the information with us at 703-778-3450. If we have sufficient information about the raid and the people in the raid, we can provide legal advice and guidance. We're also asking folks to call the hotline, and that number is 855-298-3271. And regarding the hotline, we will talk about that a little bit later and explain the function of the hotline, the role, and what's the overall purpose. And before sharing the information about that possible ICE encounter, It's always important to make sure that information is reliable. So if you saw it on Facebook or a friend sent it to you, please make sure that the information is true and reliable because we have seen on social media videos from several years ago being recirculated and posted. So it's always important to ensure that the information before you share it with folks to be reliable and accurate. Next slide. So the rights in detention, as I mentioned, ICE detention is a civil matter, which is executed under immigration laws, not criminal law. So people that are in detention have the right to consult an attorney. But as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the government is not obligated to provide one. So it's up to that individual to obtain their own representation, whether it's a private attorney or through a low cost NGO, non-government organization, nonprofit. In detention, people can request a list, as I mentioned, of free or low-cost attorneys from that detention center. While in detention, individuals have the right to contact their consulate. Individuals also have the right to call an attorney and also call their family. During detention, it's always important that no one signs anything without understanding what it is. Also asking that the information is provided in the language that they're most comfortable in. Next slide. So in Virginia, there's two immigration detention centers. One in Caroline County that is in Bowling Green, Virginia, and then one in Farmville, Virginia. So if you know of anyone that is being detained, you can look and find this information of this individual at the following website, locator.ice.gov/ODLS/#/search. This website is very helpful when trying to locate someone, whether it's a friend, family, or member, or you're just helping someone to locate someone. But it's very crucial to have the following information of that person. Their full name, their full legal name, and also their A number. Known, and when it comes to the immigration world, the alien number. So it's usually a seven digit number. So it usually says A and then it has the numbers. So that's where it's easy to find and locate that individual because that number is uniquely tied to that person's name. So if you don't have the A number of that person, this is where it can get a little complicated because you had to type their full legal name. So their first name, second name, last name, and then they have two last names, both of their last names, their date of birth, and their country of origin. It seems pretty straightforward, right? But sometimes the way that they input information is a little tricky. So perhaps the first name, they have logged it as the last name, or they put their second name, their middle name as their first name, and vice versa. So you're going to have to play with a combination of that person's name into that system before that system will shoot out where that person is located. So that's the complicated part when you do not have that person's A number. It could take a while, especially if that person has a first, a middle name, and then two last names. For legal assistance, there are several organizations that can provide support. The Amica Center is one. It's formerly known as the CARE Coalition. They are actually always visiting detention centers in Virginia. So that's Caroline and Farmville. And of course, us at Legal Aid Justice Center with assistance with bond proceedings. Just to note, since we are a nonprofit NGO, we are at times at capacity, but always feel free to call us to see if like we have openings for bond proceedings. And also, feel free to visit the website listed below at Amica Center, where they can provide additional resources for pro bono. Next slide. And something that's always important and to uplift for communities is to ensure that our communities know how to detect and avoid scam, especially when seeking legal advice. Um, for several folks that are from Latin America, notarios in our home countries are always attorneys. Here in the United States, it's not always the case. We can have folks that are non-attorneys be notaries. So it's always important to emphasize that to our communities, our clients, to be on the watch for notario fraud. All attorneys that are must be licensed to practice U.S. law in the U.S. So mention not all notaries are attorneys here in the United States. Individuals that are being represented should also understand what must be done in their case and why before proceeding. So it's always, these are good practices before someone obtains an attorney, and also to look out whether that person is doing their due diligence. Individuals should understand any document before signing it and should never sign forms with inaccurate information. It's always important that the client has the power to decide whether or not to proceed or sign a document and to ask questions. And if they don't understand the question, or if the information that's being provided is not in their native language, or if the attorney doesn't speak their native language, they can also ask for an interpretation. Attorneys should always provide copies of all applications and documents relating to the case. All individuals that have representation should always request a receipt with each payment for the legal services that are being rendered. Represented parties should always seek help if their attorneys threatens to harm them or their immigration case. And this is the most important thing, that individuals have the right to end representation and to be informed about their case. Next slide. And these are some informations that could help individuals to avoid scams. And as I mentioned, attorneys must be practicing and have their law license. For immigration, since immigration is a federal issue, it does not matter where that individual is barred. For example, we have some colleagues that are barred in other states, not in Virginia, but since immigration is a federal level issue, they can practice federal immigration law anywhere in the United States. Other individuals that can provide representation when it comes to immigration and immigration only is Department of Justice recognized accredited reps. Accredited reps are always tied to nonprofit organizations. Accredited reps are individuals that have gone through a rigorous training program to understand and begin practice of immigration law. But that accredited rep is always being supervised by an attorney. And despite the accredited rep going through a rigorous course, they still had to be supervised by an attorney and then slowly phased in to practicing and representing clients. And these are just some good websites to search for attorneys, and to also ensure that your attorney is licensed and in good standing with the bar. You can visit the website that's provided below as well. Next slide. So now we want to talk a little bit about emergency planning. Now that we explained a bit about our rights in different scenarios, whether it's at the home, schools, hospitals, workplace, public space, in your car, just like athletes prepare for a big event, whether it's the playoffs, whether it's the World Cup, they have action steps. Just like athletes have action steps in planning and planning scenarios for anything, we ourselves are going to be proactive in creating an emergency plan. And this goes to some of the questions that I've been seeing in the chat. What happens if someone is detained, a parent, while their children are in school? Next slide. So it's very important for individuals to create an emergency plan. And that emergency plan to be shared out with the places that they commonly frequent, whether it's your place of worship, it's your trusted neighbors, nonprofit organizations that you're a part of, and families. And this emergency plan would be what to do in case of an ICE raid happens, what will happen if I'm detained, who's going to take care of my children, what's going to happen with my property, and if I'm at risk of detention or deportation. It's always important to note that non-citizens should have all their immigration documents organized in one place. And individuals can create a FOIA, Freedom of Information, other documents at this website that's provided below. Next slide. So before speaking a little bit about the campaign and the hotline, with the emergency planning, we do have an emergency preparedness packet that is available on our website at justiceforall.org. And this emergency preparedness plan develops and outlines a limited power of attorney and a standby guardianship. So a power of attorney is an act that instructs an individual to have the power of said individual to take actions on X items. So for example, in the scenario, if I were ever to be detained, I had developed a power of attorney packet that would designate someone to pick up my child. The power of attorney does not force the individual to pick up my child from school. It just allows that individual to pick up my child from school. So within a power of attorney, it's always important that the individual that you are going or thinking of assigning to have that conversation with them and say, if something were to occur to me, will you be able to take these actions and pick up my children from school? With the power of attorney, it has to be reviewed by an attorney and then notarized. And that notarization has to be done by the person, whether it's both parents, one parent, and whoever they have designated to be that agent that will act in case X happens. And in this scenario, in case someone is being detained by ICE, is when this power of attorney would take place. And the power of attorney is only for personal property, whether that is your bank statements, whether it's the house that you own, whether it's your lease that you have, who's going to take over the lease, or your car. Now, for children, there's this thing called the standby guardianship, where it's a document that's filed with the court, filed in GDR, General Domestic Relations Court. And that's where someone will fill out the paperwork and say, this standby guardianship will take place if deportation or detainment happens of John. And then that standby guardianship would kick in and allow the person that I designated to be the temporary guardian of my child. All this information is available on our website, justiceforall.org. I will share that link with Rosalia and everyone else. But the emergency preparedness packet not only has a power of attorney and a standby guardianship, but it also has emergency contacts. So who should be contacted if this were to happen? And also listing all the pertinent information of everyone in their house. So let's say if your children have certain medical needs and attention, we have created a document that shows like what that medicine is of that child. Who is their primary care provider? Who is the insurance provider? Who is their doctor? Who is their dentist? So this emergency preparedness packet is very detailed, where, God forbid, if it were to happen, um, anyone around your vicinity that you have appointed as a trusted person has all the relevant information of yourself and your loved ones that live with you. So that's a little bit about the emergency preparedness packet. And it's always important to review and take your time before filling it out and then getting that reviewed and notarized. Because this is no easy task, it's difficult conversations to have, and ensuring that you identify the right person, whether to enact on the power of attorney or that standby guardianship. And now want to shift a little bit of gears about not only the emergency preparedness packet, but also the function of the hotline and the campaign known as Virginia for Immigrant Families. So the Virginia for Immigrant Families campaign is managing a hotline, where this hotline, individuals can call if ICE is at your door, or if you're wanting to report ICE that's in the vicinity or is conducting an ICE raid. This hotline is operated and trained by individuals that have been vetted, that are supporting immigrant rights, and they have been trained on how to be hotline responders. That hotline is operated from 5 a.m. to the morning till 9 p.m. at night. The reason being is that these are mostly the hours where ICE operates. So I mentioned the hotline is managed by live people that have been trained and screened to ensure that they are providing the necessary rights and are in line with immigrant rights. And that phone number is 855-298-3271. Not only does the hotline function to provide response and that immediate moment that ICE is there, but also can report ICE activity, whether it happened after the fact or during. And the hotline operates from 5 a.m. till 9 p.m. So not only does it provide to report ICE sightings and provide emergency assistance with 101 immigration rights in different scenarios, and they'll provide you your rights whether you're at the home, whether in your car, or at the work site, or at a hospital or a school. All the operators have resources at hand that goes over every scenario that they can provide you guidance. The hotline also is functioning and creating rapid response teams. So going out to see what ICE is doing and documenting and providing support to families and communities. So that's also another function of the hotline. And we're asking folks to call the hotline so we can ensure that we can get folks out there to provide support. Not only providing support in arriving at the scene and providing rights over the phone, but also providing trainings just like today and resources to the community so the community can protect themselves and their loved ones. So for folks that are not only part of ECNV, but also in other areas, like if you would like to have a workshop, feel free to reach out to the Virginia for Immigrant Families campaign, and I'm happy to drop the email in the chat. Next slide. So just want to share a little bit of resources. As I mentioned, LAJC has resources on our website, but we also have resources in Spanish that's available, reminding individuals of their rights when interacting with ICE. We do have the cards that you saw on the previous slide, the yellow cards. We have cards in our office, and we also have Know Your Rights cards when interacting with ICE. So people can call our office to obtain some of this information, and it also exists on our website as well. Resources that individuals want to fill out. So some non-citizens may want to complete, as I mentioned, a power of attorney, which is a document stating who can else be in charge of their children, finances, or other big decisions in case they're being detained or being deported. As I mentioned, power of attorneys must be signed and notarized. If non-citizens in your community want a power of attorney, they can leave a voicemail at our office requesting an appointment, and we will follow up to meet with that individual. Next slide. As I mentioned, there's these things called red cards, which are little business cards that you can put in your wallet that explains your rights when encountering an ICE agent, which is the right to remain silent, the right to speak to an attorney, and that you'll not be signing any documents without your attorney present. The cool thing about these red cards is that one side is in English, where you can give it to the law enforcement officer or the ICE agent, and the other side is in the language, the primary language of that individual, whether it's Spanish, Korean, Punjabi, Arabic. There's at this website for the Immigration Legal Resource Center, they have a lot of cards in several different languages, and you can print them on your own. And they are no longer accepting mass printing orders because they have a backlog of orders, but you can still obtain the card PDF format itself to print it out on your own or send it to a local printing press if you would like. Other resources that I have mentioned is creating that emergency contact list, as I mentioned earlier, of information of families, whether it's their health, immigration case, and all this information must be kept in a secure location where only you and your immediate family in the household knows where it lives. So it shouldn't be openly accessible by anyone. It should be at a stored location in a safe location where only you and your family knows in case detainment were to occur. As I mentioned, the standby guardianship as well is a document in case something were to happen and being detained by ICE or deported, that would allow that individual to take guardianship of the child. Now, as I mentioned, the rapid response hotline is already developed. But if folks want to volunteer to to manage that hotline, we are always welcoming operators, and we're providing training almost on a weekly basis. And I believe that is the last slide.
Yes, and amazing presentation. We have so many questions, John. I don't know if you want picked. Some of them, we understand is 220, but this is an extremely important theme that our community and our services providers should know. And I don't know, it will be up to you to pick some questions or I don't know how we can, because there's so many questions, maybe you can make 2 or 3 that are related. That would be up to you.
I'm on mute. Yeah, happy to answer some questions.
There's 2 in the.
In the meantime, talking about the red cards, Independence Center has printed cards, and we can send, yes, we can send to the groups. I'm going to write my email address, and groups can request the red cards, and we will be sending them.
Yeah, and I do want to note, and sorry that I did not mention this within the toolkit. We have expanded our toolkit not only to include power of attorneys, standby guardianships, the emergency contact list, but we also have guidance for nonprofits and community members that are worried about obtaining health benefits. So we also have a landing page under our website that talks about the rights and what things are accessible to undocumented Virginians, and also talking about public charge, because I know that's a lot of things our folks are worried about. So this toolkit is very elaborate to talk about schools, hospitals, and everything that I just mentioned.
Questions that you want to respond?
There's two in the Q&A and there's a few in the.
Yeah, I want to respond to Ms. Ramirez's question. Would parents have to provide the standby guardianship to the school directory? Yeah, anything that's being developed, whether it's a power of attorney or standby guardianship, especially if when it comes to children, circulate it with the school, your PCP, sorry, primary care provider, and dentist. So everyone that will see the child at one point are aware that there's this standby guardianship that has taken place. Oh yeah, there is the Q&A. Does the administrative warrant have to have a name on it? Yes, the administrative warrant will give guidance to that ICE agent, guidance, I say loosely, of the ICE agent to arrest that person, and it'll have that person's name. Then I want to, Paul has a question. Know of any list of interpreters who speak the language, but also about Spanish equivalent American Sign Language? That is a great question. Paul, I would have to follow up on you with that and probably reach out to the county. Because a lot of the resources that we work with, especially as a legal aid organization, we have access to Language Line, which I know most folks don't. So I want to reach out to the counties to see what resources they have. And there's one more question that I saw earlier during the presentation.
Can social workers, case managers, or mental health support professionals serve as a representatives?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that because it seems like it's very layered. And they would, if it's in their capacity as their social worker, they may want to check in with their direct supervisor or go over their manual. But anyone that the person has spoken with, and they have said yes to be that standby guardian or practice that power of attorney, they can sign on to. But to that particular question now, if it involves in the official capacity, that's where I would check in with your agency to see like where is that a conflict of interest? Is that total doable? So that's where like I would recommend folks to speak with that agency where one works at. And there is one more question that I saw, I think.
Try to, yeah. Will parents have to provide that standby guardian to the school directory? Ms. Vanessa Ramirez. Will parents have to provide that standby guardian to the school directory?
So the directory, the reason I'm struggling because some folks don't like to put their information on the directory if so it's totally up to the individual whether they want to share it to the directory, but definitely share it with front school staff, like the admin staff for sure. And now it's up to the right of that parent if they would like to update that directory where everyone has access to that, but definitely letting the school administration know. And I see there's one more question. I think it was relating to the car that I want to go
What
back.
Oh, yeah, that was
happens,
me.
what happens if I'm riding with someone who is undocumented?
Yeah, so someone if you're riding with someone that's undocumented and let's say you're being pulled over, you as a driver, you're the only person that needs to provide that information. Everyone else in the car has the right to remain silent.
Thank you. If we don't have more questions, I think we are closing. Remember, Independence Center will deliver the red cards to organizations. I was writing my email, my contact email and phone number because I do love to speak with people over the phone. And we don't have enough words to say thank you. Muchísimas gracias, John. Muchísimas gracias, Legal Aid Justice Center, for helping Independence Center and to protect our families whose children have a special education. And we are in the middle of this crisis. And this is so valuable information that we provide some kind of safeguard to the families. And I will see you tonight in Espanol. And before leaving, I would like to invite the services providers for next Thursday. I'll be presenting how about to reach and treat with cultural respect, especially in this momentous, the Latino families. That will be an statewide webinar, and it will be next Thursday, and we are finishing this. We are going to start to advertise widely that webinar. Thank you, merci. Thank you so very much for doing this for us. See you tonight.
Gracias. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, John.